Intersection Magazine Podcast.
Welcome to Intersection Magazine Podcast. It's 2024, so Happy New Year and season's greetings for those of you who are able to come through the year. Those who lost relatives, very sorry about that. You have my condolences. For those who the year has begun on a rough note, again, condolences to you too. 2023 was an interesting year, and that's why I want to have a bit of a summary for 2023 covering the magazine as well as the podcast. And so that's what I think we're going to start with for 2024. So the summary is actually work from the provider that I use. It used to be called Anchor, but Anchor got acquired by Spotify. So these are Spotify statistics. So we'll do that, and then we'll go into the magazine as well. But really, the work we do is a combination of the podcast, the magazine, as well as the blogs on some of our social media. So usually when you participate with us in any of our campaigns, you get coverage, at least in all those channels, which I believe makes them more effective. So thank you, and we hope you enjoy this episode. So first of all, I'm grateful for the Spotify service that I currently use because of the stats that they provide, as well as the summary that they give you for usage for the year, which is a really great strategy for marketing their products and getting their listenership and those who use the services to understand the markets a little bit better. And so hopefully I will be able to give you some of what I've extracted from this information or from this data, and how I plan to use it for the future, and maybe you might get some insights as how you might use it yourself. So Spotify calls this 2023 Wrapped. So what they basically do is they use their information that they exist, so they legally collect on their services, and let you know how your podcast has performed. So from what they tell me, my top episode was one I covered with a group called Akili Group of Companies. This was in Kenya with a person I had contact with. This is a contact from over 30 years ago. His name is Haron Washira. And as far as the stats tell us, that this was the most shared episode, and this took place in Kenya. And so in terms of insights, you could do this. I mean, this is up to you to decide how you want to do your podcasts. But I think for me, the most effective method was using travel to record my podcast. And when I did that, I noticed that my listenership increased tremendously for places where I actually visited the countries, where I actually had boots on the ground, if you like, in terms of accessing the people, the personalities, getting a better feel of the ecosystem, which is what I was trying to do. So if you get a chance to listen to Haron Washira's interview with Akili Group of Companies, we talked on quite a number of subjects, but I think at the core of our discussion was conservation and the subject of carbon credits, forestry, and a few other subjects. So those of you who are in that arena might appreciate going back and listening to that episode, which covered, as I said, quite a number of subjects. So from their stats, they tell me that this episode streamed maybe 170% more than the average episode. And that's useful because it can give me a rough idea how I need to, or what topics I need to cover. Of course, you need to be careful because sometimes you can find yourself being attracted to fads or products or projects that are being promoted by other people. But you can't really fight against the statistics, and you can't fight against what the listeners are saying. The other thing I found out was, in terms of who was streaming, 50% of all my streams came from Kenya. So that gives you a bit of a rough idea where my focus is going to be directed, or at least where I should put a bit of emphasis. It could take two directions. I could decide to do a few more visits, maybe do a few more episodes around the country, or what I could do is try and boost the other countries in which I'm working in the greater East African region, and maybe do some promotional episodes in those countries, in terms of also the possibilities also of expansion. Earlier, towards the end of 2023, I was in some discussions with a few people, some of whom we were able to partner with. For example, a group called Founders Freedom. And with them, what I sought to do was to have some conversations about some companies that were really of interest to me, that had established in Uganda and that had connections in Uganda, but that had closed down, in my view, prematurely. But they were employing people in my country, so I wanted to find out why they were closing. So I made a connection with this group that was provides and specializes in discussing or creating paths for the transfer of wealth for family-based businesses. And most of the companies I mentioned that were in Uganda but founded by Kenyans were actually family businesses. So we partnered with a group called Founders Freedom. And then in Tanzania, I was interested in getting a better understanding of the psyche of the Tanzanian people, the Tanzanians, Zanzibar, because from my perceptions of the country, the people are very low-key. They're not, in my view, as aggressive as Ugandans and Kenyans. But I saw quite a lot of potential in the technology and innovation spaces there. So what I did is I found someone who had been writing for the East African, Elsie Akuze, who has a column where she writes about politics, and she's an amazing writer. And so I attempted to do a bit of a partnership where she could write about some of what you should be thinking about if you want to engage with Tanzanian people for business. So we were able to run about 1 month, an article for 1 month, and I'm trying to see if we can revive that. But the plan was to see if we can do that alongside what we write in the Intersection magazine issue, which we release every month. Now, in terms of my listeners, I'm told that the top genres for my podcast listeners are religion and spirituality, business, as well as news. So in the past, I was thinking about creating, I'm not sure what they call them, but where you have a podcast package that covers several subjects in one. And one of the ideas I was thinking about was talking about religion and spirituality, which I usually cover in my blogs. I have a blog that caters for spiritual subjects. I call that, I used to have a newsletter called Reads in the Wind. And then that evolved into a blog where I talk about some subjects in religion. And then also on my Twitter, I have a handle called preacher, which is PREATCHER. So once in a while, I'll put a few ideas here and there on what I think about spirituality, but mainly from a Christian perspective. So there's a possibility that I will explore religion and spirituality as well as business and some aspects of news, but mainly religion and spirituality. And then from the stats that I got, they said that the rap, or rather the favorite music genres for my listeners were liquid funk, pop, and rap. What that could mean for me is maybe I could find a way to infuse these music genres into music clips or products that I create from the podcast and from some of the other podcasts I listen to, such as Acquired, and also My First Million with Sam Parr. What I discovered was what they do is you have a large, the podcast, which you break down into bits and then use those bits in different social media platforms like Instagram or TikTok. So what people do is you get the podcast, you break the podcast down into chunks, maybe memorable quotes or sections of the podcast that could be of interest to different users, and then you use that to further market your podcast, and also that helps you create more products out of one larger product. So that's probably something I'm going to do in terms of infusing music into products that I create. So interestingly, on Instagram, people normally use music for their clips that run for about maybe 2 minutes. But a lot of my interest in different musical compositions has been created by people who had put together clips of really good music, and all I had to do was get the name and then proceed to YouTube to find the longer version of the song. So I wrote in 2023, I think either November or December, that there were a few people that were coming across as influencers in non-traditional methods, influencers for entertainment, for music, influencers for movies. For movies, what people were doing was they were going onto their Facebook pages and creating conversations around what they were watching, and these were having quite a number of listeners and followers, and some of the things that I've enjoyed watching have actually come from conversations of that nature on Facebook, or Meta if you prefer. Now, one of the other things that people talk about in terms of social media marketing is, and I guess marketing in general, is the importance of what other people say about you to their friends. So the podcast was shared across 3 platforms using 3 methods: Instagram, WhatsApp, and then direct link. So what direct link means is people actually used the links that I had put out either on LinkedIn or on Twitter, or sent directly through email or some of the other channels to access the podcast. Now, the challenge that I faced was the podcast, for some people, if I sent them Spotify links or Anchor links, was not accessible. Or sometimes if I sent them links through the Apple podcast link, sometimes that was not accessible. But A lot of that information is available if you are able to log into your podcast management platform. Now, the great thing about Spotify for podcasters is it gives you the ability to send or to submit your podcast to some of the other popular podcast players or hosts. Then you can determine, or at least be able to increase your listenership, which is why for the last few months I've been recommending Spotify for podcasters. Now, there's been a bit of a challenge in terms of Google for podcasts. I'm not sure if this was an official statement from Google, but they were talking about discontinuing this service, which is kind of sad because I had quite a number of followers or listeners who were using Google for podcasts to engage with me and to listen to my podcast. So that was, if that is true, that's a bit sad. Now, so the stats tell me that 50% of the sharing of the podcast was dedicated or came through Instagram. 25% was shared between WhatsApp and direct link. What that means is I should find a way of making Instagram use for the podcast a little bit more effective, or pay more attention to Instagram in terms of a tool for getting the podcast out there and for other people to listen to it a little bit more. Now, my most shared episode was, incidentally, also came from a conversation I had while in Kenya. This was, I believe, in April. When I visited, I went for a tech conference I attended. I got a pass as a startup and started some conversations while I was there. And it was with the Icolo carrier, a neutral data center in Africa. And that was my most shared episode. So that was good to know. Now, in terms of the conversation I had, I believe I spoke to the marketing lead and also spoke to the sales lead, and I believe I also spoke to someone who was a little bit more technical. Now, the marketing and sales lead has since moved on to, I suppose, bigger opportunities. But also there was quite a lot of interaction on LinkedIn, because what we normally do is when we share an episode, we have a conversation about some of what we talked about. I write about that in LinkedIn, so there was quite a lot of interaction on LinkedIn from the conversation that we had with Icolo while in Kenya. So the numbers also say that we were the top 10 podcasts for 10 fans, top 5 podcasts for 10 fans, number 1 podcast for 6 fans, which was okay. We have 820 minutes of conversations created, and Kenya is our top country. Now, I have a bit of a breakdown of conversations in terms of episodes and what was listened to the most. And the episode in which we talked about FTX and some Bankman-Fried was the most listened to, followed by a conversation we had with DPO, it's a payment platform. Then we had Icolo. Then we had a conversation I had with my brother on his work in China and a company we've created called Dragon Crane Enterprises. Then we had a conversation with Emmanuel Kimaro of Bizin. He's a creator and innovator in Tanzania. And then we had a conversation with the CELO ambassadors in Kenya. Here, what I wanted to do was talk about strategies for cryptocurrencies, in terms of how to market your cryptocurrencies if you are in the East African region. So those were useful conversations. And then, as we also had, I shared a graphic from describing the Tanzania tech and innovation ecosystem. And that's surprising because all I basically had in that episode was just a discussion or extraction of information from the graphic and what my interpretation of that information was. Another was an interview with Jean Mackey of Circular Design Hub and what their offering is in the hub space or the working space and what circular design is. Then another popular conversation was one I had with Saluma Wad of Capital SSC. It got a little bit technical, which I appreciated because people tend to throw around quite a number of words which others don't understand when they're talking about venture capital, innovation hubs, startups, private equity. So lots of technical terms which he was able to break down for us to gain a better understanding. Now, one of the things I noticed about conversations that I think we should be having a lot more of was there's a lot of people in places like Tanzania speak Swahili, so there's a great need to be able to translate some of what's going on in the English language into a language that the locals understand so that they can be participants in the growth of the innovation and technology ecosystem. Another episode that people listened to quite a lot was the introduction to the Intersection Magazine podcast, which is understandable because I share that quite a lot. And in terms of audience, leading was Uganda, then the US, then Kenya, Canada, then Tanzania, then the United Kingdom, and then Germany. I also had Australia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe, followed by South Africa. Now the rest of the countries were gauged at about the same in terms of the percentage of listenership. So that is a bit useful in terms of understanding where we can visit next, or which are some of the countries that are a bit farther away but are still listening. So you might benefit from that information too once you start your own podcast. In terms of platforms, most of my listeners were using Apple Podcasts, and then others were using their browsers. And then you had Spotify for podcasters, and then Spotify, and then Google Podcasts. So Google Podcasts was at about, I guess, 2%, which sounds little but is still significant. And then my audience was 70% male, 22% female. That might be useful in terms of guiding where to direct my conversations, or maybe to feature more females, or maybe to tackle more subjects that are useful to females. Then in terms of ages, the greatest number of listeners were between the ages of 28 and 34. That's at about 48%. Second was 18 to 22 at about 26%. And then I had a listenership at about 19% of 60 and above. Of course, the assumption you make is all these people are actually giving you their ages. My guess is the 60 and above, if numbers serve me right, and if the people are doing what we think they're doing, 60 and above are probably people that are in a position to invest. And then 18 to 22 are people that are within the university setting. And then 28 to 34 are probably people that are working. So those numbers are also useful in terms of helping me understand where to direct my attention. Around the third week of releasing the podcast, I got a message from a young man called Carlos from podstatus.com. And he gave me some numbers. Apparently in Uganda, my podcast was ranked the third in the category of tech news, 38th in the news category, 61st in the tech news category, at least in the Emirates, 78th in the tech news category in Canada, and 88th in the technology news in India. This was really encouraging and gave me a bit of a boost in terms of continuing to create what I was creating. Now, in terms of what came about with the podcast, we started in February of 2023, but through and because of the podcast, there were partnerships, networking and travel opportunities in Kenya in 2023, sponsorship opportunities for the podcast, about 8 episodes. They were actually supposed to be 12. A collaboration around the subject of cryptocurrency adoption, conversations about, which we'll probably cover in 2024, about regenerative cities in Zanzibar. The cryptocurrency adoption conversations were sparked by a group that I interviewed earlier in Kenya in April. And then also conversations that we had that were able to help us gain a better understanding of Tanzania and Zanzibar and the tech and innovation systems there. For the next section, we really devoted about maybe a portion about conversations we shared on in the magazine. So we went back about 2 years. But what I have is I have an archive of the materials we've been putting together for the last 7 years. And I did this because what I did is I created the podcast out of material from the magazine. So the magazine is actually the source for some of the material in the podcast. Although conversations we have on the podcast are also based on interactions I've had with people in the space. So I get information from the magazine, but I also get information from conversations I had with people. I also get information for the magazine or focus on subjects that I have tried to read about or that I think are interesting or that I think are going to be important. So what I'll do is I'll give you a summary from January of 2022 all the way through to December, and then we'll get into December. We'll get from January 2023 to December 2023. So in January of 2022, I covered Google AdSense, how to make money with Google AdSense. And then I think I had just visited Rwanda, so I talked about Norcsen on an impact hub and the bigger picture for technology in Rwanda. So that was my first trip, and it created quite a lot of opportunities for interaction in the future. And then I also, in the piece that I call the Search for Direction, I talked about store management apps. Now, just to give you a rough idea what we have in terms of the structure, for the magazine, I have what I call under the scope. That's where we talk about one specific subject or idea. And then on the scale, we normally compare two subjects, two personalities, two products, two services, two campaigns. It's a scale, so we're comparing two products. And then the Search for Direction was created primarily to be able to give people action steps. Because sometimes when you have conversations with people, we find it more useful if we're asked or if we're given us something to do, as opposed to just having a conversation that seems to have no action steps or ending. In February, I talked about some of the best affiliate marketing websites that you should look into. And this was probably sparked by conversations that I had or that I read about around the subject of affiliate marketing and how to make money, or how people in places like the US make money using affiliate marketing. Then I also covered what I called it the state of play. I covered Nigeria's tech ecosystem. And this time, this was not because I had actually visited Nigeria, but what I tried to do was see how Nigeria's tech and innovation ecosystem is being covered by media, which means basically the internet, what I was hearing. And so, in my view, this is an important part of a successful technology ecosystem, is how the country itself, through its media, is telling its story. Then for February, I had also another section on store management apps. And this was because I was working on an e-commerce website, I think back in February or probably end of December 2021. I was working on the Dragon Crane website, and so my interest was sparked in store management apps. Then in March, I continued the conversation on affiliate marketing and also the Nigerian technology ecosystem, and also once again the store management apps. For Nigeria, I suppose one of the things that stood out was population, and also the importance of having a country or nation that has services of banks, so that's banked. And so I think those are some of the ideas that are helping to champion the technology and innovation ecosystem there. One, the population. Two, the potential for banking services in the country. In April, we continued with affiliate marketing and also store management, but also we started talking about Kenya. One of the things that I remember stirred up my interest in Kenya's technology ecosystem, apart from the information that I had heard before, talking about the Big Four, was a lady who is actually from South Africa and quite a voice in terms of venture capital. Talked about her interaction with people in Kenya's technology and innovation ecosystem and how they were so welcoming. And that stood out to me, that you can talk about all sorts of ideas when you describe the effectiveness of a technology ecosystem, but what is it like when you actually visit the country? So I think that was a plus, and that's one of the things I mentioned when describing the ecosystem there. In May and June, we covered Egypt, but I also continued the affiliate marketing websites conversation, and the page is actually called Influencer Marketing Hub. So look that up, Google that, and you might find the information useful. Now for Egypt, what I did was I found an article on talking about entrepreneurship. I think they called it Entrepreneurship Index. And this was a technical article written by some scholars in Egypt and who were talking about what makes different countries very strong in terms of their impact or their effect on entrepreneurship within their geographies. So what I did is I used that information or the report that I obtained online to connect that to the success of the innovation and a technology ecosystem. One of the things that stood out about Egypt was that they were very, very well documented in terms of describing the ecosystem. There was a structure. Every city was very well described in terms of what you can find there. There were conversations about who you can go to if you need mentorship. There were places where people you could visit or companies you could talk to if you needed venture, if you needed investment. There was information in terms of the actual startups that were on the ground, whether they were fintech startups, whether they were agri-tech startups, whether they were into tourism. And so there was a combination of information that was available online about the ecosystem that I don't think I found in any other ecosystem. So Egypt stood out in that respect. Then I also talked about SEO and SEM. Then that was in June. I compared Eversend and Cheaper Cash, what services they offer, what products you can get from them. Of course, for me, what stands out, at least right now for Cheaper Cash, is the ability to invest in stocks at the price of about $1, which is a good space if you want to learn the ins and outs of investment in stock. The other thing that's pretty useful is for those who are afraid of venturing into cryptocurrencies is both Eversend and Cheaper Cash allow you to invest in some select cryptocurrencies. I think it's maybe about 10 for each of them. And so you can start off with small amounts, monitor those small amounts. When the value goes up, you can cash out. So either if you're short-term or long-term, that depends on you. But I think both Eversend and Cheaper Cash are useful tools for investment in crypto and in the case of Cheaper Cash for investment in stocks. Then in August, what we did is we got Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, and put them all in the magazine. I must have missed, at least in the presentation, I think I missed the section where, in the presentation where I covered South Africa's technology and innovation ecosystem. But I suppose if you're going to compare Silicon Valley and the Big Four, the place where I think is most similar to Silicon Valley is probably South Africa, because there are quite a lot of partnerships with universities, and then of course a very attractive business environment, as well as proximity to the sea or the lake, the ocean. So some people tend to feel that it feels quite a lot like San Francisco in those regards. I also found quite a lot of interaction between universities and the innovation and technology ecosystem. Later on in our podcast, I had an interview with someone who has been pretty effective in the innovation space in Gauteng in South Africa, so you could listen to that when you get some time. I also covered his book, Bolts and Nuts, in my book review a few months ago, so you might also enjoy that. In September of 2022, I also covered Jumia and Safe Border. And then I interviewed a young man called Lincoln Angufibo. He's a developer. Now, if you go back to around July, August, I made a transition where after some conversations, someone suggested that I do a bit of work on the magazine cover, so you will find some changes in structure between July and August. I was working with software called Zara, and then I also got introduced to the online software called Canva. Maybe we'll be exploring other options as we go along. Now, the section which I call the search for direction was devoted to giving people direct steps or ideas about where to go for certain opportunities, or but what we ended up doing for that section was it evolved into a place where I interview or I have question and answer sessions with people who are working in specific technology related subjects. And so the first one was with the developer in September. In October, I had another person in user interface, user experience work, Gertrude, who I also met after a class in copyright at one of our local universities. Then we also tackled a bit of cryptocurrency. We talked about the Ethereum merge. And then I also had an article from Bill Gurley on how to increase your revenue by 10x. That continued in the month that followed. I also, from the subject of cryptocurrency, had an article about Celo, which has been instrumental in a lot of the work that we did in 2023, because the ecosystem lead at Celo, Dan Kimotho, was very useful in helping me understand what Celo is doing in the country and in the region, and also giving me access to the ambassadors of the Celo ecosystem in Kenya and Greater East Africa. For the month of November, I also interviewed Katharina Hartwig, who was working in Rwanda. And then in December, we did Uganda Innovation Week, continued the article on 10x revenue by Bill Gurley, and also Vincent Nwona of Microsoft. I had a conversation with him. He's an MVP, so very skilled in his area of expertise in Microsoft. He works in Nigeria, so I had a conversation with him. Then we got into 2023. So Uganda Innovation Week, I think this was the second part of the same piece. Had an interview with Kenneth Twesige of TechBuzz Hub. I also wrote about the hub that is hosted in a city, in a place in Kampala called, pretty close to the capital city. I suppose it is in the capital city. Interestingly, I also was able to get some sponsorship for access to their space by a friend in the US, so that was a really great boost. I was able to use the facility for a few days in the month of December. And in terms of internet speeds and some of the other metrics I use for determining which spaces I make use of, they tick all the boxes. Then in February, I had a piece where I talked about, I think I got this piece from LinkedIn, 5 reasons why Indians make great CEOs. This was interesting because around the same time, there were some major changes in British government and some firsts for the kingdom. Then I also talked about the flywheel model. I had a conversation on technology and banking with a young man called Gad Zermakenga from the US, but a previous contact. Then I talked about in March thematic investment. Then we also covered venture capital. I think this was a piece by the South African lady that I mentioned before. I believe her name is Hope Ditliakanye. Then I also had a piece on East Africa Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. In April, we covered the Swarm Summit 2023. We also talked about venture, or rather private equity. Then I had a conversation with Esterica Bonero, who has done quite a lot of work in terms of innovation in the social space. She was the contact I came in touch with at the Swarm Summit. In May, we continued the conversation around the Swarm Summit. We also talked about social media strategy. I also covered game design. In June, we covered East Africa Com. This was the meeting that enabled me to connect with some of the people that we covered in the podcast. So yes, if you're looking for material for podcasts, you do good to attend conferences and technology-related events in those settings. We also had a piece on copywriting and sales funnels. I also had a conversation around clothing design. We also covered a meeting with a group called DevFest. The meeting was called DevFest 2023. I suppose they had 2 meetings that year in 2023. Last year they had one earlier in the year and then one in around November or December. Then I also covered Kotani Pay after a partnership with them. Then there was also a piece on Dorisa Cheng. Now the difference is this time I interviewed the person in charge, while before we talked about the Venture Capital Association of East Africa. Then in August, I was having conversations, or I was trying to see how we could do expansion, if I could do expansion. And one of the things that I normally do is when I use a service, I like to review the service for the magazine or for the podcast. So I covered Fuzu to see how they could help me hire talent. I also visited my first TEDx event in Lubowa. Then I interviewed a young man from Boom Africa Group, a very talented, very educated young man. And then I also featured the piece that I mentioned before on Tanzania and Zanzibar and how to understand their psyches. Then I also featured the first piece from Founders Freedom. I compared LinkedIn with Fuzu. I found that the LinkedIn version is naturally cheaper because it's free, but also I was able to generate some conversations from the LinkedIn staffing page as opposed to the Fuzu page, because when you paid for the services, the amount you paid for a month, which is about 300,000 Uganda shillings, maybe less than, maybe about $80, was catered for. I suppose it catered for the advertising, but it did not give you access to the people that you were seeking to have conversations with as potential hires. So you had to do the research yourself. In September, we also talked about the Tanzania and Zanzibar ecosystem, or Tanzania and Zanzibar as investment destinations. I also had a conversation with a voiceover artist. Then Founders Freedom shared a piece from LinkedIn where they were talking about how funding will not solve your problem. October, we covered angel investment, venture capital, and investment syndicates. We also had an analysis of Uganda's top 100 taxpayers. The plan was to see which industries are most profitable and where we can put attention or have attention, I suppose, as people that are into technology or that are into innovation. We also had a question and answer session with Farouk Bemagisa of Washables. And then a piece on recruiting board members from Founders Freedom. We continued the conversation around investment syndicates. We also compared Airtel TV and Yo TV channels. We featured John Vianney of Cyanase. We also featured a conversation about governance for founder-led organizations. In December, we did an intro to Linux. We also covered mental health. There was a Q&A with myself as the founder of Intersection Magazine and Intersection Magazine podcast. And that was 2023. Now, in terms of a summary for the magazine for 2023, I think the highlights was collaborations between the Kenyan crypto payment solution provider Kotani Pay, and the visit to the Tanzania Zanzibar ecosystem. Collaboration with Founders Freedom for financial information and information resources. as well as inroads into understanding the social psyche of Tanzanians and Zanzibaris, I suppose for business purposes, but also for those who wish to expand into the area. We also were able to increase our subscription list, our paid subscribers. And then also another plus that has helped gain us a little bit more viewership or readership is the merger between the magazine, the podcast, and our social media channels and our blogs. Thank you.